The sand felt like glass under Captain Marcus Chen's boots as he moved through the darkness. His team of 12 operators followed behind him, their equipment silent despite carrying enough firepower to level a city block. The desert wind carried the smell of diesel fuel and fear from the compound 3 kilometers ahead. "Shadow 6, this is Overwatch," came the voice through his earpiece. "Thermal shows 43 heat signatures in the target building. Confirm your approach vector." Marcus pressed his throat mic. "Overwatch, Shadow 6. Vector unchanged. We're moving to Breach Point Alpha in 12 minutes. The compound ahead housed what intelligence called a high-value target meeting. 3 months of surveillance had revealed this location as a gathering point for terrorist leaders from 7 different organizations. Tonight, they would all be in one place. Tonight, the war would take a significant turn. Staff Sergeant Kelly Rodriguez crept up beside Marcus, her rifle ready. "Sir, the locals are calling this place cursed. They say anyone who enters after midnight never comes out." Marcus nodded. The villagers had good reason to fear this place. For 2 years, people had disappeared in these hills. Entire families vanishing without trace. The official reports blamed bandits, but Marcus had read the classified files. Something else was happening here. "Rodriguez, take Thompson and Kowalski around the east wall. Nguyen, you and Hassan cover the vehicle depot. Everyone else with me through the main entrance." The team split without a word. These operators had worked together for 3 years across 4 continents. They moved like parts of a single mind, each knowing exactly where the others would be at any given moment. As Marcus approached the compound's main gate, he noticed something unusual. The metal bars were bent outward, as if something had exploded from inside. But intelligence reports showed no recent explosive activity. The damage looked old, weathered by years of desert storms. "Sir," whispered Corporal David Thompson over the radio. "You need to see this. East wall has claw marks. 3 parallel lines, each about 6 inches apart. They go 15 feet up the concrete." Marcus frowned. No animal in this region had claws that size. He signaled his team to hold position and moved to examine Thompson's discovery. The marks were deep, carved into reinforced concrete like butter. Whatever made these marks possessed incredible strength. "Overwatch, Shadow 6. Requesting immediate analysis of compound history. Any reports of unusual incidents or encounters? Shadow 6, stand by." The minutes stretched while Marcus waited for intel. His team remained perfectly still, disciplined despite the growing sense that something was wrong with this mission. The thermal imaging had shown 43 people inside, but the compound felt empty. "Dead. Shadow 6, Overwatch. Records show the compound was abandoned 6 months ago after a construction accident. 17 workers killed, bodies never recovered. Local authorities sealed the area indefinitely." Marcus felt ice in his veins. Their intelligence had been wrong. Dead wrong. This wasn't a terrorist meeting. This was something else entirely. "Sir," Rodriguez's voice carried an edge he'd never heard before. "Movement in the main building. But it's not human movement. It's too fast, too erratic." Through his night vision scope, Marcus watched the building's windows. Shadows moved behind them, but the shapes were wrong. Too tall, too angular. They moved with a fluid grace that reminded him of hunting cats, but scaled up to impossible proportions. "All teams, prepare to abort mission. Something is not right here." Before anyone could respond, the compound's lights blazed on. Every window, every doorway, every external fixture suddenly burned with harsh white light. The team's night vision went blank, leaving them exposed in the open desert. "Contact left," shouted Nguyen. The sound that followed would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. Not gunfire, not explosions, but a howling that seemed to come from the earth itself. A sound that spoke of hunger and intelligence and terrible purpose. Through the spots dancing in his vision, Marcus saw them emerge from the compound. They moved on 2 legs like men, but they were not men. 8 feet tall, covered in what looked like metallic scales, with arms that hung nearly to the ground. Their heads were elongated, predatory, with eyes that reflected the harsh lights like mirrors. "Fall back! Fall back to extraction point!" Marcus shouted into his radio. His team moved with professional discipline even as terror clawed at their minds. These operators had faced insurgents, pirates, and enemy special forces. But nothing had prepared them for creatures that seemed to ignore the laws of physics and biology. The fastest creature reached Kowalski first. The Polish operator managed to fire 3 rounds center mass before it was on him. His rifle rounds, designed to punch through body armor, sparked off the creature's hide like fireworks. Kowalski's scream cut through the night, then stopped abruptly. "Kowalski is down! Kowalski is down!" Thompson's voice cracked with panic. Marcus watched his man disappear into the darkness, carried by something that moved too fast for human eyes to track. 20 years of military service had taught him that every mission carried risks, that soldiers sometimes didn't come home. But this was different. This was impossible. Overwatch, Shadow 6. We have contact with unknown hostiles. Request immediate extraction. We are dealing with non-human entities. Repeat, non-human entities. The radio crackled with static. When Overwatch finally responded, the voice sounded strained. "Shadow 6, please repeat your last transmission." "Did you say non-human?" "Confirmed, Overwatch." "Whatever these things are, they're not from around here." "Conventional weapons have no effect. We need extraction now." Another creature bounded across the sand toward Rodriguez's position. She emptied her magazine into it, each shot perfectly placed. The bullets had no more effect than throwing pebbles. The thing reached her and she vanished into the darkness with barely a sound. Marcus's tactical mind raced through options. His team was being systematically eliminated by something that shouldn't exist. The mission parameters meant nothing now. Survival was all that mattered. All remaining personnel, convergence point Delta. Move now, leave everything non-essential. The 6 surviving operators ran across the desert, abandoning equipment they'd carried for thousands of miles. Behind them, the howling grew louder, joined by others. The pack was hunting. Hassan stumbled and fell, his ankle twisted in a rabbit hole. Before Marcus could reach him, 2 creatures emerged from the sand itself, as if they'd been buried and waiting. Hassan's final transmission was a prayer in Arabic, cut short by sounds Marcus tried not to think about. 5 personnel remaining, Marcus reported to himself, knowing Overwatch was probably too far away to maintain clear communication. Moving to alternate extraction. But, as they crested the ridge overlooking their planned helicopter landing zone, Marcus saw the aircraft burning in the distance. Whatever these creatures were, they had anticipated military tactics, planned for their arrival, turned their own procedures against them. Thompson grabbed Marcus's arm. "Sir, look at the sky." Above them, lights moved in formation. Not aircraft, not satellites, but something that defied easy categorization. They pulsed with the same harsh white radiance as the compound, and they were descending. Marcus realized with crystalline clarity that his team hadn't stumbled into a terrorist meeting. They had walked into something much worse. Something that had been waiting for them specifically. The question was why. The remaining operators took defensive positions behind a cluster of rocks, checking their remaining ammunition. Each man carried enough firepower to stop a tank, but conventional weapons seemed useless against their hunters. "Sir," Nguyen whispered, pointing toward the compound. "Look at the thermal signatures now." Through his scope, Marcus saw the truth. The 43 heat signatures weren't people at all. They were the creatures, and they had been waiting in the compound for exactly this moment. The entire mission had been a setup from the beginning. The lights in the sky grew brighter, and the howling stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus heard something that chilled him more than the screams of his dying teammates. Voices, speaking in perfect English, discussing their team's movements, their equipment, their tactics. These things had been studying them. Overwatch, if you can hear this transmission, abort all similar operations. The enemy has capabilities beyond our understanding. They know our procedures, our equipment, our weaknesses. This was never a terrorist gathering. This was a trap. The radio remained silent. Either Overwatch couldn't hear him, or there was no longer an Overwatch to hear. Marcus looked at his remaining men and saw his own thoughts reflected in their faces. They were special forces, trained to handle impossible situations, to complete missions others couldn't even attempt. But training couldn't prepare them for an enemy that operated outside the rules of reality itself. The lights touched down around their position, and Marcus saw his first clear view of what they were really facing. The creatures emerging from the craft were the same species as the ones hunting them, but these wore equipment that looked almost familiar. Almost like military gear, but designed for beings with different proportions, different capabilities. As the circle tightened around their position, Marcus made his final transmission. If anyone receives this message, know that humans aren't alone in this universe. And we're not the apex predators we thought we were. The last thing he saw before the lights overwhelmed everything was one of the creatures removing what looked like a helmet. Underneath was a face that was almost human, but not quite. Intelligence burned in those mirror eyes, along with something that might have been satisfaction. The desert fell silent except for the wind carrying sand across empty rocks. When morning came, the only trace of the operation would be scattered equipment half buried in the dunes and a few disturbed patches of sand that might once have been defensive positions. In a bunker 3,000 miles away, analysts studied the final transmissions from Shadow Team 6. The recordings would be classified beyond the highest security levels, filed away with similar reports from teams that had encountered things that weren't supposed to exist. The war everyone thought they understood had just revealed itself to be something entirely different. And humanity was losing battles they didn't even know they were fighting. Colonel Sarah Mitchell stared at the classified report for the third time in 2 hours. Shadow Team 6 had vanished completely in the Syrian desert, leaving behind only scattered equipment and impossible testimony. The final transmission from Captain Chen spoke of non-human hostiles with advanced technology and intelligence-gathering capabilities that exceeded anything in human military doctrine. "Ma'am, you have visitors," announced Lieutenant Parker from the doorway of her underground office. "They don't have appointments, but they have credentials that override everything." 3 individuals entered her office wearing civilian clothes that couldn't hide their military bearing. The woman in front carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, while the 2 men flanking her moved like predators scanning for threats. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm Director Amanda Cross from a department you haven't heard of. We need to discuss what happened to Shadow Team 6. Sarah closed the file carefully. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Director. Our records show that teams suffered equipment failure during a training exercise." "Colonel, we both know that's not true. We also know that similar incidents have occurred 17 times in the past 8 months. Teams going dark, impossible after-action reports, and cover stories that don't hold up to scrutiny." Cross sat down without being invited, her companions remaining standing. "What we're about to tell you is classified beyond anything you've encountered. Your security clearance just got upgraded to levels that don't have names." Sarah felt the familiar weight of secrets settling on her shoulders. After 22 years in special operations, she recognized the moment when everything she thought she knew became insufficient. "Show me what you have." Cross opened a tablet and turned it toward Sarah. The screen displayed a world map dotted with red markers, each one representing a location where military units had encountered something outside normal parameters. Afghanistan, 2019. Delta Team reports contact with hostiles using energy weapons. Somalia, 2020. Navy SEALs engage targets that demonstrate superhuman speed and strength. Yemen, 2021. SAS Team encounters aircraft technology 50 years ahead of anything in our inventory. The markers covered 6 continents. Whatever was happening, it was global in scope. The pattern became undeniable 6 months ago, Cross continued. These encounters are increasing in frequency and intensity. The entities involved demonstrate detailed knowledge of our tactics, our equipment, and our operational procedures. You're talking about aliens. We're talking about a threat assessment that requires immediate response capabilities. What we call them is less important than what we do about them. Cross swiped to a new screen showing personnel files. Sarah recognized several faces from special operations communities around the world. British SAS, German GSG-9, Israeli Sayeret Matkal, Russian Spetsnaz. We're forming a joint task force with operators who have survived encounters with these entities. Men and women who've seen what conventional military thinking can't handle. We need your expertise in unconventional warfare. What makes you think I have relevant experience? Because you were part of Operation Blackwater in 2018. The mission that officially never happened. The one where your team encountered something in the caves beneath Kandahar that required complete memory suppression for the surviving operators. Sarah's blood went cold. She had no memory of any operation called Blackwater, but the name triggered something deep in her mind. Fragments of images, sounds, feelings that didn't connect to any mission she could recall. That's impossible. I would remember. Cross slid a photograph across the desk. It showed Sarah in military gear, standing beside operators she didn't recognize, in a location she'd never seen. But her face in the photo carried an expression of terror that felt familiar. Selective memory suppression was considered necessary for operational security. But recent events have made it clear that hiding from this threat isn't sustainable. We need soldiers who've faced these entities before, even if they don't remember. You're asking me to join a unit that fights aliens based on memories I don't have of experiences that were supposedly erased. I'm asking you to help save the human race from a war we're losing because we refuse to acknowledge we're fighting it. Cross stood and moved to the small window overlooking the base. Colonel, what would you do if you discovered that every major military setback of the past decade wasn't due to tactical failures or intelligence gaps? What if our enemies had been receiving assistance from a source with technology centuries ahead of ours? The implications hit Sarah like physical blows. Ambushes that seemed impossibly well coordinated, equipment failures that occurred at exactly the wrong moments, intelligence leaks that suggested enemy forces knew their plans before they were finalized. How long have they been here? We don't know. Historical records show anomalous incidents going back decades, possibly centuries. What we do know is that their involvement has escalated dramatically since humans began developing advanced military technology. Cross returned to the desk and opened another file. This one contained photographs that made Sarah's hands shake. Military vehicles twisted into impossible shapes, weapons that had been disintegrated rather than destroyed, and personnel casualties that defied medical explanation. The entities demonstrate complete understanding of human military doctrine because they've been studying us for generations. They know how we think, how we fight, how we respond to different threats. We're fighting an enemy that knows us better than we know ourselves. What kind of operational parameters are we talking about? Total compartmentalization. The task force exists outside normal command structures. No nation claims it, no government acknowledges it, and no traditional rules of engagement apply. You would be fighting a war that officially doesn't exist against an enemy humanity refuses to believe is real. Sarah studied the personnel files again. Each operator had survived encounters that should have been impossible, faced enemies that shouldn't exist, and continued serving despite experiences that would break most people. Why me specifically? Because your psychological profile shows unusual resistance to cognitive dissonance. You've commanded units in situations where normal military thinking wasn't sufficient. And because Operation Blackwater left traces in your mind that could be reactivated with proper stimulus. Reactivated how? Cross produced a small device that looked like a combination of medical scanner and electronics project. Neurological pattern restoration. It's experimental, but it's proven effective in recovering suppressed memories related to entity encounters. And if I refuse? Then, you continue your current assignment while the war escalates around you. More teams like Shadow 6 disappear, more operators die fighting enemies they can't understand, and eventually the entities decide that covert observation isn't sufficient for their purposes. Sarah looked at the map again, noting how the red markers were clustering around major population centers. Whatever these beings wanted, they were positioning themselves closer to civilian areas. What's the mission structure? Small teams, maximum 12 operators. Rapid deployment anywhere in the world. Equipment includes both conventional weapons and technology adapted from recovered entity materials. Your team would investigate incidents, gather intelligence, and, when necessary, engage hostiles using tactics developed specifically for non-human opponents. Success rates? 60% survival rate for team members, 40% mission completion rate. It's dangerous work against enemies that don't fight like anything we've trained for. Cross closed the tablet and stood. Colonel, I need an answer. The entities are becoming bolder, more active. Yesterday we lost contact with a research station in Antarctica. This morning, a cargo ship in the Pacific reported unusual aircraft that disabled their engines without warning. Time is a luxury we don't have. Sarah thought about Captain Chen's final transmission, the terror in his voice as he described something beyond human experience. She thought about the gaps in her own memory and the photograph showing her face twisted with fear she couldn't remember feeling. If I agree, what's the first mission? Recovery operation in the Romanian mountains. A village of 200 people vanished 3 days ago. Satellite imagery shows structural damage consistent with the entity's technology signatures. Local authorities are blaming it on a landslide, but geological surveys show no seismic activity. Timeline? Departure in 18 hours. Your team would consist of operators from 4 different countries, all survivors of entity encounters. Equipment includes experimental weapons designed specifically for these opponents. Sarah made her decision with the part of her mind that had kept her alive through 2 decades of impossible missions. The logical analysis could come later. Right now, instinct told her that humanity needed soldiers willing to fight a war they didn't understand against enemies they couldn't comprehend. I accept the assignment. Cross nodded as if she'd never doubted the outcome. Welcome to Task Force Prometheus, Colonel. Your new identity packet is in that folder, along with mission briefings for your first deployment. Your cover story is medical leave for combat stress treatment. As Cross and her companions left, Sarah opened the identity packet. Inside was a passport she'd never seen, credentials for organizations that didn't officially exist, and a photograph of herself in uniform she didn't remember wearing. The neurological device Cross had shown her lay on the desk, waiting. Sarah picked it up and felt a slight tingling sensation as it scanned her brain patterns. Suddenly, images flooded her mind. Caves beneath Afghanistan, creatures moving in the darkness, the smell of ozone and burnt metal, and the sound of her own voice screaming orders to soldiers whose names she'd forgotten. Operation Blackwater came back in fragments. Her team had encountered an underground facility that wasn't built by any human civilization. The entities inside had technology that seemed like magic, weapons that killed without sound, and intelligence that anticipated every tactical decision her team made. Sarah remembered now why the memories had been suppressed. The truth was too large, too terrible for human minds to process while maintaining operational effectiveness. But, now, with entities becoming more active worldwide, the luxury of ignorance was ending. She picked up the mission briefing for Romania and began reading. 200 people vanishing overnight was just the beginning. The real war was starting, and humanity needed soldiers prepared to fight for a species that didn't yet understand the magnitude of the threat they faced. Outside her office window, normal military operations continued. Soldiers trained for human opponents, prepared for conventional warfare, secure in their understanding of how conflicts worked. None of them knew that the rules had changed completely, that the enemy was already among them, and that the next phase of human history would be written by whoever proved more adaptable to impossible circumstances. The helicopter touched down in a field outside Brasov at 0300 hours local time. Colonel Sarah Mitchell jumped out with her new team, 12 operators from 6 countries who shared one common experience: they had all faced the entities and lived to remember it. Radio silence from here forward, she announced through hand signals. Standard patrol formations don't apply. These targets can predict conventional military movement. Sergeant Major Klaus Weber from Germany's GSG-9 took point, his movements deliberate and unpredictable. Behind him, Captain Yuki Tanaka from Japan's Special Forces Group moved in patterns that seemed random but covered all possible approach angles. The team had trained together for only 72 hours, but they adapted quickly to fighting enemies that learned from human tactical doctrine. The village of Raznov lay 3 kilometers ahead through dense forest. Satellite imagery showed no signs of life, but thermal scans revealed anomalous heat signatures and patterns that suggested organized activity rather than natural phenomena. "Contact," whispered Lieutenant Ahmed Hassan through the comm system. The Egyptian operative had survived an encounter in the Sinai Peninsula where his entire unit had been eliminated by entities using weapons that seemed to manipulate gravity itself. Through her night vision scope, Sarah saw movement between the trees. But the figures weren't quite right. They moved with purpose but not like humans navigating difficult terrain. Their gait was too fluid, too coordinated, like they were communicating through methods her team couldn't detect. "Weapons check," she signaled. Each operator carried conventional firearms loaded with ammunition designed specifically for entity encounters. The rounds contained cores of material recovered from crashed entity craft, projectiles that had proven effective against their armored hide. Additionally, each team member wore gear that disrupted the electromagnetic signatures entities used for communication and coordination. Corporal Maria Santos from Brazil's Special Operations Command raised her fist, indicating enemy contact ahead. Through her scope, she could see 3 entities moving through the village ruins, their elongated forms clearly visible against the destroyed buildings. "They're searching for something," she reported through the secure channel. "Methodical patterns, like they're looking for specific items or information." Sarah studied the village layout through her tactical display. Every building showed signs of the same destruction they'd seen in Syria, walls blown outward as if by internal explosion, but no chemical residue or shrapnel patterns. The entities had weapons that caused structural failure through unknown principles. "Weber, take Martinez and circle north. Tanaka, you and Kowalski approach from the east. Everyone else with me through the center. Remember, these targets learn from engagement patterns. No repeated tactics." The team split with mathematical precision, each operator moving according to plans they'd developed for enemies that could anticipate human military thinking. Their approach routes followed no standard doctrine, incorporating elements of chaos theory to prevent prediction. As Sarah moved closer to the village, she noticed details that the satellite imagery had missed. The ground was scorched in geometric patterns that suggested energy weapons with incredible precision. Whatever had happened here wasn't random destruction but targeted elimination. Colonel Hassan's voice carried tension. "I'm seeing evidence of human resistance. Barricades, defensive positions, spent ammunition casings. The villagers fought back before they were taken." "Any bodies?" "Negative. Just bloodstains and signs of struggle. They were captured, not killed." Sarah felt ice forming in her stomach. The entity's operational patterns had changed. Previous encounters showed them eliminating human witnesses immediately. Now they were taking prisoners, which suggested their mission parameters had evolved. Through her earpiece, she heard Weber's report from the northern approach. "Contact with entity technology. Some kind of scanning equipment operating in the village center. It's definitely not human manufacture." The device Weber described appeared on Sarah's tactical display as a pulsing energy signature. Whatever it was scanning for, it had been operating continuously since the village was attacked 3 days ago. "All units, converge on the scanning device. These entities don't leave equipment unattended unless it serves a specific purpose. We need to determine what they're looking for." As the team moved into the village proper, Sarah noticed that the destruction followed patterns that seemed designed to herd the population toward specific locations. The entities hadn't attacked randomly but had used precise strikes to force the villagers into predetermined gathering points. "Movement," reported Tanaka. 3 entities approaching the scanner. They're carrying equipment that looks almost like our communication gear." Through her scope, Sarah watched the entities interact with their technology. Their movement showed intelligence and coordination that suggested complex communication methods. But more disturbing was their apparent familiarity with human military procedures. These things know how we operate, she whispered into her microphone. They're positioning themselves to counter standard special forces tactics. Weber's voice crackled through static. Colonel, the scanner just changed frequency. It's definitely detected our approach. Sarah realized with growing alarm that the entities weren't just hunting randomly. They had anticipated military response to the village attack and prepared accordingly. The scanning device wasn't searching for villagers, it was searching for soldiers. All units, abort approach. This is a trap designed specifically for special operations teams. But, even as she gave the order, Sarah knew they were too late. The entities had lured them into the village using standard military response patterns, then positioned themselves to eliminate the team using tactics adapted from human special forces doctrine. Contact left. Martinez's voice carried panic as energy weapons lit up the night. The projectiles moved too fast for human eyes to track, but they made sound like tearing metal as they passed through the air. Weber is down. Kowalski's transmission cut through the chaos. These things are using our own tactics against us. Sarah watched through her scope as entities moved between buildings using techniques that mirrored Special Forces urban warfare doctrine. They understood cover, concealment, and coordinated fire support. But they executed these concepts with superhuman speed and precision. Santos, Hassan, fall back to extraction point. Everyone else, fighting withdrawal. Don't establish defensive positions, they'll anticipate them. The surviving team members moved through the village using improvised tactics designed to confuse enemies that learned from human military thinking. Instead of standard bounding over watch, they used random movement patterns. Instead of conventional cover, they created concealment through misdirection. But the entities adapted even to unpredictable tactics. Sarah watched one of them analyze her team's movement pattern in real time, then position itself to intercept their escape route with mathematical precision. These targets have processing capabilities beyond human intelligence, she reported through the emergency channel. They're learning our adaptations as quickly as we implement them. Captain Tanaka managed to get close enough to the scanning device to plant an explosive charge. The detonation revealed the true purpose of the equipment. It had been downloading information from human communication devices, learning about military response protocols and special operations procedures. They've been studying us, Tanaka reported as she fell back under heavy fire. The scanner contained data on dozens of military operations. They know everything about how we respond to situations like this. Sarah understood with terrifying clarity that humanity was fighting an enemy that had turned their own expertise against them. The entities had observed human special forces for years, learning their methods, their psychology, their weaknesses. Now they were using that knowledge to eliminate the most capable soldiers humanity could field. Extraction point is compromised, reported Santos. Multiple entities between us and the helicopter landing zone. They've anticipated our egress routes. The team found themselves trapped in the village center, surrounded by enemies that knew exactly how they would respond to tactical situations. Every move they made was countered by entities that understood human military thinking better than most human commanders. New plan, Sarah announced. We do something they can't predict because we don't know what we're doing either. Random movement, no coordination, pure chaos. Meet at the church in 15 minutes if you're still alive. The operators scattered without predetermined patterns, each making decisions based on instinct rather than training. For the first time in the engagement, the entities seemed confused by human actions that made no tactical sense. Sarah sprinted through the village using routes that violated every principle of military movement. She climbed onto rooftops that offered no tactical advantage, moved through buildings that provided no cover, and changed direction according to pure randomness rather than strategic thinking. The approach worked because it abandoned everything the entities had learned about human military behavior. They had studied Special Forces tactics extensively, but they couldn't predict actions that followed no tactical doctrine whatsoever. Church secured, reported Hassan as team members began converging on the meeting point. Lost Weber, Martinez, and Kowalski. Everyone else accounted for. Sarah looked at her surviving team members and saw her own realization reflected in their faces. They had encountered an enemy that could outthink human military intelligence, anticipate special forces tactics, and adapt to new situations faster than human soldiers could implement them. "This changes everything we thought we knew about fighting these entities," she said. "They're not just physically superior, they're intellectually superior. They've been studying human warfare and they've learned to be better soldiers than we are." Through the church windows, they could see entities methodically searching the village for their position. But now they moved cautiously, their confidence shaken by human behavior that made no sense according to their understanding of military doctrine. "What's our next move?" asked Santos. Sarah looked at the tactical situation with new understanding. Traditional military thinking was worse than useless against enemies that had mastered human warfare. Success would require abandoning everything they had learned about fighting and developing entirely new approaches to conflict. "We learn to fight like something other than soldiers," she said. "These entities have studied human military behavior, but they haven't studied human civilian behavior, criminal behavior, or pure survival instincts. We need to become something they haven't encountered before." The surviving members of Task Force Prometheus prepared for extraction, knowing they were returning with intelligence that would change how humanity approached the hidden war. The entities weren't just technologically superior, they were tactically superior because they had learned from humanity's best warriors. The real war wouldn't be won by better soldiers. It would be won by humans willing to fight in ways that soldiers weren't trained to consider, using methods that abandoned military doctrine entirely in favor of pure human unpredictability. 6 months after the Romanian disaster, Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood in a warehouse in Detroit that didn't exist on any official map. Around her, 47 individuals prepared for operations that challenged every assumption about warfare, military doctrine, and human capability. These weren't soldiers anymore. The woman checking explosive devices had been a street magician before Director Cross recruited her. The man calibrating communication equipment was a former car thief who understood evasion better than any military academy could teach. The team leader reviewing tactical plans had spent 10 years as a homeless veteran before discovering he could think in ways that entities couldn't predict. "Status report," Sarah announced to the assembled group. Maria Santos, now wearing civilian clothes and looking nothing like a special forces operator, stepped forward. "Insertion teams are ready for simultaneous deployment across 12 locations. The entities have established observation posts in major cities worldwide. We hit them all at once using methods they won't anticipate." The transformation had been necessary and painful. Task Force Prometheus had discovered that military thinking was humanity's weakness, not its strength. The entities had studied human warfare so thoroughly that they could counter any tactical approach taught in military schools. But they hadn't studied how criminals, artists, homeless people, and social outcasts approached problems. Equipment check, called Ahmed Hassan, who now supervised a team of former gang members turned urban warfare specialists. Their understanding of city fighting came from streets, not textbooks, giving them advantages that entities couldn't predict. The weapons they carried looked nothing like military equipment. Improvised devices built by engineers who had never seen military specifications, using principles that violated standard doctrine. The entities had learned to counter human military technology, but they hadn't encountered weapons designed by people who didn't know what was supposed to be impossible. Sarah walked through the preparation area, observing teams that would have horrified conventional military commanders. Former drug dealers worked alongside ex-circus performers, creating operational plans that combined criminal enterprise methodology with entertainment industry misdirection techniques. Colonel, reported Klaus Weber, the sole surviving military operator who had successfully transitioned to non-military thinking. "Psychological profiles show the entities are becoming frustrated with our new operational methods. Their standard response patterns aren't effective against tactics that make no sense according to their understanding of human behavior." The breakthrough had come when a former street performer named David Chen, no relation to the captain who had died in Syria, successfully infiltrated an entity observation post by pretending to be a homeless person collecting aluminum cans. The entity's sophisticated scanning technology had ignored someone who appeared to have no military training or strategic purpose. "Teams Alpha through Delta, final briefing," Sarah announced. The group gathered around a table displaying city maps marked with entity activity. But these weren't military tactical maps. They showed locations identified by homeless networks, criminal organizations, and urban exploration communities, human groups that noticed unusual activity because they operated outside conventional society. The entities have established monitoring posts to observe human military responses, Sarah explained. They're particularly interested in how special forces units adapt to previous encounters. But they're not monitoring civilian populations because they don't consider non-military humans strategically significant. Team Alpha consisted of former convicts who understood how to move through urban environments without attracting official attention. Team Beta included street artists who could access buildings through routes that didn't appear on architectural plans. Team Gamma was composed of former addicts who had learned to think creatively under extreme stress. Team Delta featured individuals who had survived homelessness and understood how to be invisible in populated areas. Execution begins at 2100 hours local time across all target zones, Sarah continued. Remember, the moment you start thinking like soldiers, you become predictable. These entities have studied military behavior, but they haven't studied human survival behavior. Captain Tanaka, now dressed like a food delivery worker and carrying equipment disguised as restaurant supplies, raised her hand. What if they adapt to our new methods? Then, we adapt faster, replied Sarah. The advantage of fighting without doctrine is that we can change everything about our approach without violating training or protocol. Military units are limited by what they've been taught. We're limited only by human imagination. The teams dispersed to their deployment zones using transportation methods that would have amazed conventional special forces. Former gang members used networks of modified vehicles that could navigate cities without appearing on traffic cameras. Ex-circus performers employed skills for moving through urban environments in ways that security systems weren't designed to detect. Sarah's command team established operations center in an abandoned subway tunnel, using equipment installed by urban explorers who had been mapping forgotten underground spaces for decades. The entities might have infiltrated government communication networks, but they hadn't penetrated communities that operated completely outside official systems. All teams in position, reported Santos through a communication network built by former hackers using techniques that government agencies had never encountered. Beginning infiltration of target locations. Through hidden cameras installed by urban exploration teams, Sarah watched as her operators approached entity observation posts using methods that defied military logic. A former street magician walked directly past entity sensors while performing misdirection techniques that confused their scanning technology. A group of ex-homeless individuals set up positions around an entity facility by establishing what appeared to be a homeless encampment. Contact established, reported Team Alpha leader Jack Morrison, a former car thief who had learned to disable sophisticated security systems. Entity technology is extensive but focused on countering military threats. They're not monitoring for civilian-level activities. The infiltration proceeded with success that would have been impossible using conventional special forces methods. The entities had prepared for military tactics, technological warfare, and coordinated assault patterns. They hadn't prepared for humans who approached problems like criminals, artists, and people fighting for daily survival. Intelligence gathering complete, reported Team Beta through their secure channel. Entity communication intercepts show they're confused by human behavioral patterns that don't match their analysis models. Sarah studied the intelligence flowing in from all 12 target locations. The entities were operating under the assumption that humans would respond to threats using military, police, or government resources. They had established monitoring systems designed to track official responses while remaining invisible to conventional surveillance. But they hadn't considered that humans could organize effective resistance using skills learned from poverty, crime, artistic expression, and social marginalization. The entity's sophisticated intelligence gathering missed entirely networks of people who survived by being invisible to official systems. Phase 2 initiation, Sarah announced. All teams proceed to equipment placement. The devices being installed weren't military explosives or surveillance equipment. Former gang members placed jammers built by engineers who had learned electronics through illegal activities. Ex-circus performers installed monitoring devices in locations that required acrobatic skills to access. street artists created visual disruptions that confused entity scanning systems through techniques developed for avoiding police surveillance. Entity response detected, reported Hassan. They're attempting to counter our activities using anti-military protocols. But our operators don't match any patterns in their response database. Through her command display, Sarah watched entities trying to respond to infiltration methods they couldn't categorize. Their tactical systems were designed to counter military units, terrorist cells, and government agencies. They had no protocols for dealing with resistance organized by homeless networks, criminal enterprises, and artistic communities. Teams Charlie and Delta proceed to primary objectives, Sarah ordered. The primary objectives involved disabling entity communication networks using techniques that violated every principle of electronic warfare taught in military schools. Former hackers employed methods that government agencies considered impossible, while urban explorers provided access to infrastructure that wasn't supposed to be reachable. Success on all fronts, reported Team Charlie leader Sarah Kim, a former computer criminal who had learned to think about technology in ways that formal education discouraged. Entity communication systems are designed to resist government-level cyber attacks. They can't handle street-level hacking techniques that ignore proper protocols. The operation reached completion without a single casualty among human operators. The entities had proven vulnerable to approaches they couldn't predict because their intelligence gathering had focused exclusively on official human responses to threats. Extraction complete, Sarah announced as teams withdrew using methods that left no trace of military activity. All objectives accomplished with zero entity adaptation to our tactics. Back in the underground command center, Sarah reviewed the intelligence gathered from 12 simultaneous operations. The entities possessed technology that exceeded human capabilities by centuries, but they had one critical weakness: they thought like military strategists. Their entire approach to dealing with humanity was based on studying human warfare, government responses, and official threat management. They had learned to counter military thinking so thoroughly that conventional forces couldn't challenge them effectively. But they hadn't studied how humans survived when military solutions weren't available. They didn't understand how people adapted when faced with problems that couldn't be solved through official channels. They couldn't predict responses from individuals who had learned to think creatively under impossible circumstances. Final report for Director Cross, Sarah dictated to her communication team. The entities can be defeated, but not by soldiers fighting as soldiers. Victory requires humans willing to abandon everything military doctrine teaches about warfare and conflict resolution. The hidden war would continue, but now humanity had discovered its advantage. The entities had studied human strength and learned to counter it completely. They hadn't studied human weakness and how it could become strength when circumstances eliminated conventional options. The future of the species would be determined not by the best soldiers humanity could produce, but by the most adaptable humans, those who had learned to survive when proper methods weren't available, who could think creatively under extreme pressure, and who understood that sometimes the only way to win was to fight in ways that made no sense to anyone, including themselves. As Sarah prepared her final transmission to the official channels that still believed they were fighting conventional threats, she smiled at the irony. Humanity's salvation would come from the people society had overlooked: the criminals, the homeless, the artists, and the misfits who had learned to survive by being unpredictable. The entities had studied human civilization and learned to defeat it. They hadn't studied human chaos, and that would prove to be their fatal oversight in a war they thought they had already won.